Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the Chair of NHS Improvement, Baroness Harding of Winscombe.
Oh, goodness. There we go. Come on then, team. Right, we'll get our panel settled. You either have to have a walking stick or wear polka dots on this panel, pretty much. That's the rule. So, I've got a pretty amazing group of people to join me to discuss diversity in the NHS. So, firstly, on my right, we have Marie Gabriel. Marie Gabriel, CBE, I should say. Exactly. Chair of ELF, East London Foundation Trust, Chair of Newham Community Health Council, 20 years in senior roles in local government and the third sector, an honorary fellow of the Borough of Newham, I'm told, and HSJ's inaugural inspirational women on the list. I've got a quote from Marie. I've got a quote for each of our panellists, so that we can get our heads around the way they think. A quote from Marie was, "It's all about your personal commitment. And I currently mentor 4 black women with 2 recently promoted into senior roles in the last 4 months. So it is all about what you actually do," quote Marie Gabriel. So my first panellist. On Marie's right, we have Sam Allen, CEO of Sussex Partnership. You're now worrying what your quote is, aren't you? Partnership FT, 21 years in the NHS, chair of the Health and Care Women's Leaders Network. And Sam, you've talked about your journey from receptionist to CEO. And you said, "I don't bring any magic potion with me to this role as CEO. I will simply bring myself to work every day, smile and treat others how I wish to be treated." That struck me as a pretty brilliant way of introducing your approach to being a CEO. Can we welcome Sam? Now, Mark. Mark Doughty, and I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong, I know, a senior consultant with the King's Fund, specialises in leadership and organisational development with a particular focus on developing patient and community-based leadership. Member of the NHS Leadership Academy faculty, director of the Centre for Patient Leadership. Now, your quote, Mark, your quote, "Patient leaders live with or care for people with long-term conditions, illnesses, injury or disability. Other roles we have are incidental, but can support our patient leader roles. For example, I work in the King's Fund as a leadership development consultant, but I still see myself as a patient leader." So, fantastic. On Mark's right, we have Dr. Amir Hannan, full-time GP in Hyde. You're really worried about your quote. Director of your local GP Federation, chair of the West Pennine Local Medical Committee, chair of the Association of Greater Manchester Local Medical Committees, co-chair of the Greater Manchester NHS Values Group, and chair of the World Health Innovation Summit. Quite a role of honour. Now, in 2013, you said, you were asked, actually, who in healthcare inspired you the most. It's just a brilliant quote. It said, "Patients, especially when they overcome disability." And I mean, you said, "I work in a very deprived neighbourhood, and yet there are so many inspiring people all around me who have done so much with so little." So, welcome to the panel. And then finally, at the end of the row, our extra special guest, Sarah Jane Marsh, Chief Executive of Birmingham Women's and Children's. Now, you've been at the Children's Hospital as CEO for 9.5 years. Taken on the women's as well for nearly 3 years. Now, your quote is quite a recent one and has caused quite a big stir, and we're going to use it to kick off the discussion. So Sarah Jane quite recently said on Twitter that she decided not to sit on any senior interview panels anymore where there wasn't at least one black or ethnic minority person on the panel. Now, we're going to kick off the discussion here. Now, before we do, I should say I need to start by asking all of you a question. We're going to just take a poll of the audience before we hear from our panellists. A simple question on the app that we've been using for the day. Are NHS boards capable of leading and managing the equality, diversity and inclusion agenda? Yes or no? We've only had 4 votes so far. If you get your phones and apps out.
Oh, wow.
Interesting.
Like a dance.
It is interesting as the votes go up. At best, we're at 60-40 yes. Keep going. I'll give you a couple more minutes. Growing in confidence. There's some actually unconscious bias in this, I think. The more people see the answer, the more they're joining the majority. So roughly 60% of us think that boards are capable of leading on this agenda, but it's not an overwhelming endorsement. We're going to come back at the end and ask you the same question to see whether anybody's minds have been changed. And we'd like to make this session as interactive as possible. So if you want to ask questions on anything in this really broad and important topic, please start thinking about them, because once we've kicked off the discussion, I'm going to go straight out into the audience and get your views. So I want to start, Sarah Jane, with your statement.
Yes.
Kicked up quite a reaction. Can you tell us what it is that you were trying to say, and tell us what's happened since you said it?
Okay, so it's something I've been thinking about for quite a long period of time. I mean, I work in Birmingham, and the patient group that we serve is almost 50% of people from diverse backgrounds, Black, Asian and minority backgrounds. And whilst we have a lot of people from BME backgrounds working in our trust, as you start to get to the most senior levels, that falls away very dramatically. I know it's a pattern that we see across the NHS. I think having the res data brought that into even more sharp relief for us, and I think the stat that I was feeling very, very uncomfortable with, that you were 1.8 times more likely to be appointed from a panel interview at Birmingham Women's and Children's if you were white than if you were from a BME background. And my thought process were, either white people are twice as good at things as black people are, which is clearly rubbish, or something else is going on. Yeah. And it's what to do about that something else that's going on, because there's there's thousands of things, and I'm not trying to pretend this is the answer, but I just thought, what can I do as the chief exec right now to make a commitment that I want this to stop, and I want people to come and work in the organisation, see its diversity and bring all their fantastic skills and background to it. So I thought one visible way I can do that is to make sure that I never sit alongside a white wall of people in an interview, having people come into the room and their confidence and their performance levels drop because they think this organisation's not diverse, it's not for me, I don't want that. So that was the decision that I took. Several people in the organisation have followed me, but it's not a target, it's not mandatory. I think you've got to believe it in your heart. If somebody tells you to do it, you can find 1,000 reasons why there's an issue with it. But if, I want people to follow because they want to do it. The backlash was very significant on social media from that at the time I first said it. I think probably 70 to 80% of the responses were a misunderstanding, that I'd said I would only appoint BME people from an interview. So I think people just misread it or misunderstood it or whatever. But even from those people who did understand it, there was a sense that it wasn't right. And the overriding comment, which drove me to distraction, was we should recruit on merit, not on diversity. And that's the bloody reason why I'm doing it, because of course we should recruit on merit, and that's not what we're doing now. So my answer to that is yes, I concur with you, it should be merit, but we're not doing it on merit now unless white people are twice as good, and they clearly aren't. I then did a Sky News interview, and the backlash for that was horrendous. It continued on social media, but I've had several complaints now sent to my boss that I should be sacked, that I've incited violence against white people, that it's a criminal act that I've undertaken, that people want white patients safeguarded in my organisation because there's an issue with how I'm willing to treat white people. So it's been it only makes me more determined, but it's been a massive eye-opener for me, because if people have got those kind of views, then that's why we're in the position that we're in.
Yeah. Marie, can I go to you You next. As a chair, would you endorse your chief executive doing this? Is Sarah Jane doing the right thing? Should she be doing something different?
I mean, absolutely. It's not something that actually is unusual. It's something that people were talking about back in the 80s, about making panels that recruit people more reflective of the communities that they serve. And in fact, I'd be more worried about the backlash that we had from within the organisation and what my board was doing in terms of leadership, in terms of creating a culture that inclusivity and equality and diversity was the way in which we operated in that organisation. So I think completely the right thing to do. And actually what we need to do now, I'd be thinking, is let's look at our organisation and the whole range of things that we can do, actually. Because what the evidence has shown us as well, you can do all sorts of things in terms of developing and supporting black staff, but if they go into organisations that are unsupported, then that doesn't come to fruition.
Mm-hmm. Sam, what are you doing in your trust?
Well, I mean, first of all, I just want to say, to quote Millicent Fawcett, courage calls for courage everywhere. And I think you're an absolute role model, Sarah Jane. And I think the backlash that you have received is abhorrent. And I think that actually as a chief executive and all chief executives, we should stand shoulder to shoulder and we should all commit to do exactly the same thing. I think just to broaden it out, so for me it's a leadership issue. I think the question to the audience is really interesting because I absolutely believe that NHS boards are hugely talented, and if we really grapple with this issue, we can tackle it, but we need to do more to understand it. And the work that colleagues have led on RES has been wonderful, yet we've got the data and information, yet why is it taking us so long to achieve change? And if I look at some other organisations, PwC, for example, when the gender pay gap information was published earlier this year, they've got a 44% gap between the median pay for men and women. They've actually made a similar statement, which is they will no longer have all male shortlists. And I think, again, we need to look at diversity from every angle and make sure it's a leadership issue.
Mark, what are we getting right and getting wrong on this?
Well, I would echo what everybody said, and I think there's something around, I'd be interested, coming from the patient perspective and somebody from within the community, looking at my local NHS organisation and watching and hearing this debate going on, I'd be really wanting to know how the leadership and the board in particular are reflecting on and working with the issues that this is raised, because there's a real opportunity here for the board to show leadership in absolutely modelling and showing a culture that really respects diversity and inclusion. I would also just say that it has to be addressed, because I can equally imagine other groups of staff who feel that they might be marginalised or not heard or not seen, like disabled staff, saying, and this is not putting either or, but saying, how can we be heard as well at those really important conversations? So I think what for me it does is it generates an opportunity to have conversations about this, because you obviously can't, I would imagine it's incredibly difficult when who you put on those panels, but it needs to be talked about. That's the key thing. If it generates a conversation, fantastic.
There's something very important, I think, in what you've just said about how you make sure that everybody in the organisation feels heard. Amir, can I put that to you? Where have you seen this work where leaders have created a culture where people around them do all feel heard?
Well, if I step out of healthcare and look at the police in particular and the Macpherson inquiry, following Stephen Lawrence's death, the Home Office set standards, very clear standards, looking at the recruitment, looking at the progression, and looking at the training of not just BAME candidates, but also women as well. And the Home Office itself held the police constables, or whoever they're at the top, the equivalent of the chief executives, to account. And that wasn't a 5-year plan to come back in 5 years' time to see what had happened. But every 3 months they were called in. So I think if we can set up sensible standards that are actually monitored and performance and chief executives are held to account for this, then you are going to see that change. And actually, we saw that change in the police service. I'm sad to say that we haven't seen that in the healthcare service. I'd like to say thank you, Sarah, for bringing this up, because as a Muslim and as an Asian person, I hear this amongst my own colleagues. Consultants and GPs like myself, we do get into those senior positions. But when you're starting to think about senior management, particularly around the management side of things, there seems to be, and they're highly qualified, they work very, very hard, but they can't climb up the ladder. And there's a real sense of frustration out there. Now, we here in Manchester, Greater Manchester, we've got a very diverse population here. 10% of the population here is Muslim. That's huge. And yet we don't see that reflected across the public sector. If you look at the NHS, if you look at the local authority, if you look at the police, if you look at even voluntary sector organisations, and you look at the senior management team, does that reflect the local population? And if it doesn't, what do we need to do to change that? And the reason for doing it, by the way, is because there's not enough money in the system. We can't pay more and more for substandard care. Whereas we do know that if you have a senior leadership, if you have a non-exec director who takes this on as their role to ensure that they hold the chief exec, the board to account, put the right people in there, you have a connection between the front line and the board itself, and not just the frontline staff, but the population that you're serving, you'll see a very significant improvement in efficiency and productivity.
So one of the metrics that nationally, all inside and outside the NHS now, we all have to report is the gender pay gap. So we hear that at a national level, if you're a woman, you're going to earn £10,000 less a year as a doctor than a man. What should boards be doing? What are your boards doing to address the gender pay gap in your organisations? Sam, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like I'm sure all NHS trusts out there, we've reported on our gender pay gap. That's absolutely only the start, and it just starts to tell you really the scale of the challenge in the organisation. And I think in looking at the data, we mustn't just look at it from the single lens of gender. We have to look at other aspects of diversity. And one of the things that we've seen in our own organisation, and the RES data tells us about the NHS in general, is that people make it into more senior positions are not representative of the workforce. And 77% of the NHS workforce is female. Yet why is it that less than 25% of medical directors on NHS boards are women? Why is it that less than 30% of finance directors are women? And when we get into conversations, the challenge that we really face now is around how do we support people in their career development? How do we look at flexible working practices? How do we look at job sharing arrangements? And that's the workforce today, but perhaps the biggest challenge we're facing across the NHS is Generation X and Y, and they want to work in incredibly different ways. So the Health and Care Women Leaders Network, which the NHS Confederation kindly supports, we've been doing webinars on flexible working and really stimulating the conversation, which is, it starts with measuring the data, but actually as boards, it's understanding it from not just the lens of gender and then putting in proactive steps to support people to take up those more senior positions. And just the final point I would make is it's wonderful that Professor Jane Dacre has been asked to lead the gender pay gap review specifically for doctors. I do think we have a real issue with doctors. That coalesces itself around bonus payments. In the NHS, we call them Clinical Excellence Awards. In my own organisation, there's a 54% gap in the award of Clinical Excellence Awards, and I think it is very similar actually across the NHS. Why is it that women are not putting themselves forward? Why aren't they going on to develop their careers? And we have to fundamentally understand that, and that's going to require a shift in mindset and a different way of doing things.
Marie, what are you doing to tackle the gender pay gap at Elft?
So obviously you have the information, and I think one of the things we've learned from the RES is the richness of the information that you have to enable you to know where you are and where you want to go to. I think what's really important for my board is actually looking for examples of best practice, and you don't always find that within the NHS, to be honest. And so we have been working with other organisations, for example Ernst Young and Deutsche Bank, to look at what are they doing in the private sector to try and bridge these gaps and identify things that will work. The second thing we're doing is basically working with our women's network. because they feel it and they know it, and they will tell you how it operates within your organisation. So you'll know about the pay gap, you can know some general things from research, but actually until you have those conversations with your staff about the barriers that they are experiencing as they try to progress through the organisation, I think that is quite difficult for you to have the solutions.
And are there any top tips that you can share, some nuggets that you've learned as you've listened to your teams?
I think it's quite interesting you're talking about the sort of the Clinical Excellence Awards. So we started looking at that about 3 years ago, and one of the things we've learned is what we judge as important in those awards. So it's about the amount of research you do. It's about so a whole range of things that requires you to be working full-time without breaks, really, to be able to get the awards. Yeah. So what we had to think about is that women who take career breaks to raise children actually will not have the same ability to have that whole range of experience. So it's actually about how we have a look at what we judge as excellence. That it always starts, I think, with the organisation and breaking the barriers and systems within. And then there was a whole bit about women not thinking that they were able to apply or they had the skills to apply, and so making it really clear and going out and actually talking with other clinicians about the importance of putting yourself forward, how the applications should look, so that they can be judged and scored independently to show that you do have that knowledge and experience.
Brilliant. So I'd like to start opening up to the audience. Oh, brilliant. We've got a hand up already. I'm hoping there's some people who are going to appear quickly with numbers and paddles and microphones. We've got a gentleman right in the middle.
I wouldn't mind, yeah. It's Jagtar.
Thank you. Jagtar.
I heard the whisper go first. I wonder what he's going to ask us. Well, I think my diversity champions in the NHS are sat in front of me. I see a wide range of expertise and experience on the board. I look around me, behind me, alongside me, I see empty chairs. The problem with this agenda is that the converted are in the room. Those that are not on your journey and are going to get anywhere near making a difference are way outside this room, are in the bars and clubs. My ratepayers' money has paid their £300 to be here in this room and to be listening to this tough debate. So, Sarah, well done in raising that debate. And a good example of what's going to happen in your trust, Bedfordshire Police Force, for 10 years while I've been their audit chair, have told me that they're committed to equality and diversity. They're committed to changing the workforce. For 10 years, not a single black police officer was appointed. New chief constable came in, new crime commissioner came in, they gave me the commitment. I said, I'm not interested in your commitment, I'm interested in your outcomes. In the last 2 years, 35% of the intake has been BME because the panels now reflect the community. So you will make a difference. My question to you is simple, because I could go on. And my question is simple.
I'm not saying anything.
How do we get the people outside in this room? How do we get somebody on the panel that is prepared to say that diversity doesn't matter?
Right, okay.
Mark, do you want to answer that first?
I think it's absolutely about honest conversations. And if we take it back to what I want to, from a patient, from a staff, from a community perspective, I want to see the leadership from my local NHS organisations absolutely modelling a culture that is prepared to be open, is prepared to be inclusive, is prepared to encourage my participation in decision making, in getting involved in the quality of the care that's being delivered. And the only way that can be done is if the boards reflect my local community, not only in diversity of thought, diversity around the table, but in diversity of thought, that we break out of silo mentalities, we break out of a particular mindset, and they have the courage to be prepared to listen. And it's about truly listening. And it is about saying things which provoke conversation, and then truly listening and showing an attitude and approach which absolutely reflects the NHS constitution and values. Because I hear so much about patients being at the centre and staff being, you know, staff need to be really supported as well if we want patients to be at the centre. And so many times I see a disjunct between what is being said and what's being done, and somehow we need to encourage it, but not in an adversarial, confrontational way. I really worry about silo mentalities being created amongst community and patient groups as they too get into an adversarial relationship. It doesn't help us.
Marie, you want to come in?
I just wanted to say, actually, Jagtar, as you all know, I think this is about holding people to account. And in the same way, if this conversation was about money, they would be in the room. So I think it's actually about boards being responsible and actually a requirement of the leadership of the board to ensure that they are in this room, and actually realising that it's injurious to their career if they're not here, if they're not seen here. Because that does matter to leaders, and I think it's really good to be encouraging and open and supportive and helping people with the narrative. But actually, the way we do get things changed in the NHS and have the emphasis change is by saying you have to do this, and then the reasoning behind it will catch up eventually.
Yeah. Amir, you wanted to come in.
Lord Darcy talked about quality being the thing that brings us all together, and of the three aspects of quality, safety. So we're all driven by that. And I also recognise that money is the other thing that drives many people. So coming back to what do we do about the female gender gap, which comes back to Jagtar, your issue about how do we get people back into the room here. Well, I tell you what, the first thing I would do today, if I was a chief executive, was contact the HR, director of HR, director of finance, and immediately say, any women who are below the gap for the same role, same responsibility, should immediately be paid the same amount of the same money, straight away, immediately. There's no question about it. That's about being fair. Now, the minute that happens, then all those people that are in the pub or whatever are going to come running down here and say, wait a minute, if that money's going there, where's the rest of it going to come from? Well, let's start talking about quality and safety and the reasons why you said that actually we can do things better if we are more fairer. So that would be my take on it.
Sam?
I suppose, you know, great point, Jagtar. When I think about, just thinking about from the gender perspective, I think about the progress the FTSE 100 companies have made, and they've now got more women on their boards than they ever have done. However, recently, when chairs and chief executives of those companies were interviewed, and albeit they were a small number of quotes, there were quotes such as, I've got my woman, it's somebody else's turn. So the last thing I would want is tokenism. And for me, it's about changing mindsets. And I think we need to be really honest that we've got to educate people. We've got to build the capability. People still find it some people find it really uncomfortable talking about all aspects of diversity. They don't feel equipped. So maybe we need to look at some board development and start there. And that's perhaps something that we could do right across the NHS.
Sarah Jane?
So I'm going to have a try with my colleagues in the West Midlands. We have a regular chief execs meeting. I'm just going to talk to them a bit about my experiences and try and stoke up the energy. That's one of the things I'm going to try and do to do the spread. I feel the journey I've made myself over the past 2 years that's probably made the difference is I've flipped a little bit from the business case into the moral case, and I think this is where I've potentially got myself in trouble. When you start talking about representative of the patients you serve and needing to understand, you know, all of those things, people are comfortable. When you say it's just not fair, it's just not morally right for people to be judged differently because they look different to you, and usually because of the colour of their skin. That's, as chief executives, one of the main things we have to do is create fairness and equity. So it's just not right, is it? And I think the moral case for it is the bit that we don't really talk about, and it's really uncomfortable. My interim chair just, for a year, he was a guy from a BME background. He said, part of the problem is, Sarah Jane, people are too scared to say anything in case they say the wrong word, in case they use the wrong phrase, in case they offend somebody, and so they don't say anything. And I just thought, I think that's been me. And now I'm going to say it, and I'm probably going to get it wrong sometimes. But I'd rather get it wrong than not say something.
Let's take a couple of comments and questions. We'll take 2 or 3, and then we'll get a panel response. So should we go to number 3 first, as you're in my line of sight?
Thank you. Gerald Dixon, West Midlands Ambulance Service, Brummie. Yeah, absolutely. RES, and we've heard that term used a few times. We know it's linked to patient outcomes. Mm-hmm. So therefore, it's linked to good patient care. It's also linked to leadership. We notice that we've got the people not here. That's really important because ultimately that's what we're there for, to deal with patients. So what we've got here, and I'll actually have to stand up, is the RES team, RES Frontline Forum and the RES Expert Programme. And I really think it's important that we recognise what we're trying to do and work with the board to deliver this race agenda. Can we stand up, guys and girls?
Woo-woo!
And this is Yvonne.
Very true.
And we're here to work with the boards, and hopefully we'll do so.
Brilliant. Let's go up to number 4, and then we'll catch 1 and 2 as well before we get a panel reaction.
Hi, thanks. I wanted to first of all say thanks a lot for your collective efforts and also the efforts that you've made individually. But I guess my concern comes to a comment that was made earlier around tokenism and the way that it can be incredibly disempowering. And one thing I think I didn't get a sense of is how you are going to empower individuals in your efforts. Because I think to myself about the time before I came to this country, and someone said to me, the only way that English people ever treat you as an equal is to show and to prove to them that you are better than they are. And that actually, strangely enough, was empowering. So tell me how, through all these things that you've done, how you will empower the individual.
Fantastic question. We'll go to number 2, and then I promise we will come back and make sure the panel answer it.
Samina Arfan from Haywood, Middleton, Rochdale, CCG. I'm quite interested in the intersectionality issue. So when we're talking about the gender pay gap, what about the BME women within there? Is there differences? I'm sure there is. And even within disabilities, when we're talking about disabilities, are we addressing those intersectionality issues as well? So I do think there needs to be cross-cutting themes that need to be looked at.
Thank you. And then number 1.
Thank you. Probably a comment and a question. It's Steve Mcmanus from the Royal Berkshire Hospitals. The comment is, again, thanks to the panel. I think one of the strongest things that we can do as leaders is just to have the conversation in our own organisations. When I was appointed as Chief Executive of the organisation, I had a panel and 2 widespread stakeholder groups. And on one of the stakeholder groups, I was asked what I was going to do about kind of inclusion and including the staff in the organisation. My first comment back was, that's a great question. Just look around. Everyone on both stakeholder panels and my interview panel were white. So one of the biggest things we've been able to do is just talk about what it feels like to be black, or feels like to be a woman, or feels like to have English as your second language as a leader in your own organisation, and start the debate. The question is, and it's probably not to Dido, given your announcement about a Chief People Officer and that being replicated at the regions, what would the other panel members like to see in the job description?
Brilliant question. Right, let's start. Sarah Jane, how are you going to empower your people, given what's just happened? What's going to be your approach?
Well, I think that's my job as Chief Executive, is to empower every single person in the organisation to be the very best that they can be, whether that's in the care that they give or the leadership they show or whatever else that it is. Now, I think I've got quite a good track record of that, and generally there's lots of positivity in the staff survey in my organisation about it being a great place to work, but there is discrepancies in that, and you know, as the lady commented down there, it is definitely not the same for all staff. And so we've set up a diversity and inclusion group. There's some fantastic people come through that, and they've absolutely started to come up with ideas for themselves. They really didn't want it to be chaired by me or a board or whatever. It was absolutely about them, their ideas, supporting each other, coming up with things that they felt would make a difference. The chair of that recently sat on our NED appointments. It was absolutely fantastic. He was holding Bruce Keogh to account for some of the questions he was asking about equality, and it was just it just created a great atmosphere. I think that people just felt that they were being listened to and having their own opportunities. So I think some of it's universal for all staff, for everybody to know that they, you know, so long as they're doing the right thing for patients, they can do whatever it is that's right, but then having some just greater support structures, I guess, for some staff who just potentially just don't feel that they've got the confidence, or they're not listened to, or they're going to hit barriers maybe that other staff wouldn't hit.
Brilliant. Mark, you're an expert in leadership and development. What should be in the job description for the NHS England NHS Improvement Chief People Officer, so we get this right?
I think there's something about mindset. I really, there's something about, something that's quite simple, which for me it's around, it's the quality of the relationships we create, and it's the quality of the conversations we have, and it is something about being value driven, and it is something about paying attention to those things, and showing and acknowledging that there is this sense of care at the centre of what we do. And it's knowing, I would want to know how you are absolutely going to empower and support your staff to actually have the ability to feel that they're being listened to and cared for. Because one of the things that I experience as a patient who regularly uses various parts of my healthcare system is the number of times I come across staff who are burnt out, who are stressed out, and who don't feel cared or listened to, and purely because of the pressures they're under. And I know that feeds back to me. So somehow I would like the people who are overseeing this to truly get that and to model it, to absolutely, truly model the focus on care. And that does take a challenge on mindset, because it does take the ability to reflect on our assumptions and beliefs and to make them explicit. Because,
So in other words, it's as much about how the Chief People Officer behaves themselves and the values that they hold as anything to do with the what that they might do, isn't it? That's what you're really saying.
Absolutely. Right? It's very easy to give all the right answers, right? But the one thing is, we're not daft. People can say all the right things. I'm still not going to speak up if I think, am I really going to be heard? Am I going to be listened to? Does this person really care?
Yeah, thank you. Amir, would you like to just reflect on each of the three questions, because I suspect we're going to run out of time quite quickly.
I think it's about delivering results, isn't it? When you can see results, it gives you confidence that we can do this, and we've got to make organisations and people that work in those organisations feel that they can make a change. When you've got organisations where, let's say, there were no female people on the board itself, if the chief executive turned around and said to the panels, we want to make sure that, for instance, 50% of all the applicants are female, and then make sure that there is a competitive process, so that, like Janie was saying, it's not just about saying we're going to positive discriminate, but actually if 50% of the applicants are female, the chances are some of them are going to rise up. And let's celebrate that, and let's start to demonstrate that we've made a change.
Sam, how do we empower people?
So I'm going to be really honest. I think, I mean, I'd certainly actually echo what Sarah said. That's certainly something, you know, I really believe in terms of leadership styles. But I think it's really quite challenging to truly empower people unless you have environments and cultures where people feel psychologically safe to be themselves. And I think, you know, as a mental health trust chief executive, if you've got an environment where people can be, if they choose to be open about their lived experience of mental health and bring that aspect of diversity into the conversation and really influence it, you've got a safe culture, and then you're enabling people to be empowered. But it is challenging, I think, and some of the feedback that I get is that perhaps in some areas of our culture, and it may be Jagta, it's the bit that isn't in the room today, is there that psychological safety where people can truly feel empowered to be themselves?
Marie.
So I think, so in ELFT we talk a lot about and think a lot about being very engaged with our staff that started before the quality improvement work that we did actually. And the culture that we try to describe in ELFT is based on Mike West's work, which he's already doing actually with NHS and others around how do you create an inclusive culture. So I think part of this for me is the information and knowledge is out there, and we just have to make sure people access it. And it's the same from the res as well. So a res has a whole range of best practice, but I just want to big up the Frontline Forum, because the Frontline Forum are a group, when we talk about empowering others, of people whose organisations will, willingly said, yes, work with these individuals. They're not always senior leaders, and they have been supported by 2 people to discuss their experience of working as BME people within organisations. And they came to the Res Street Advisory Group, which I chair. And it's the first time I had people that were sirs, and there's a lord in the room, and people like that.
We're not that scary, you know.
Anyway. But those people in the room, more than any other Saga meeting, were scribbling like crazy. We had 5 brilliant people who were telling it like it is, and they were saying things that I hadn't heard before. So saying things about it's your communication. So your boards can say it's brilliant, actually, and you'll have us who will be saying it's brilliant, but there's this whole sphere of people in the middle where the messages don't get through and connect. You know, Elfa looking at calling those middle managers core leaders. They talked about, sort of real help with the narrative, that people do struggle with the narrative. They talk about a whole range of things, which we've now sort of built into the RES programme, that learning. And I think there's nothing better than actually empowering people to speak. And sometimes that's given them the privilege to not do that within your organisation.
Brilliant. We're running out of time, I'm afraid. We've got about 20 seconds left, and I know everyone's, but we've got to stop. I'd just like to take a quick temperature check after that conversation on whether or not, as the team focused on this, those of us in the room who have shown up, whether we believe that it is possible for boards to really change the NHS and move this agenda forward. So could you get your apps out again and just take us, I'm hoping the screen will change. There we go. Are NHS boards capable? Can we do it? Now, isn't that fascinating? A little bit more groupthink needed, otherwise I'm going to go home depressed. We've only got 3 votes. I think that doesn't count as enough of a democracy yet.
I think they're having technical.
You're allowed to... have we got, I tell you what, show of hands.
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
Can you put your hands up if you are more optimistic as a result of this conversation? Or optimistic at all? And can you again, this is a safe space. Can you put your hand up if you're less optimistic, you're more concerned? Oh, it's interesting.
The rest team.
Yeah, there is a lot of work for us to do on this agenda. And I mean, I'm very new to the system. This is my 7th month in the NHS, and it is not an accident that I have chosen this section to be part of, because personally I think that changing the culture is the silver bullet to ensure a sustainable NHS that we all love and care about. And I think you are all at the vanguard of this because you've chosen to show up. So thank you to my brilliant panel. Thank you for the contribution. I'm sorry we haven't had everybody's comments. We'll continue the conversation. Well done.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Chief Executive of NHS Confederation, Neil Dixon.
Ladies and gentlemen, if we could just sit down for this final session. Our next speaker, Jon Ashworth, was appointed as Shadow Health Secretary in 2016. He's advocated returning the NHS to its Bevanite origins by carrying out a full-scale assault on health inequalities. He's also placed much emphasis on improving the life opportunities for children and young people, and he suggested the next Labour manifesto will be about making the next generation of children the healthiest generation in the world. As I revealed earlier, John's really sorry that the Brexit votes have prevented him from joining us, but we are grateful that he has taken the time to record the following message. So, Jon Ashworth.
But can I start by thanking the Confed for commissioning the recent IFS Health Foundation report. There's no question that report has really shaken the debate ahead of the settlement for the NHS on its 70th anniversary. Now, my opposite number, Jeremy Hunt, has considerably heightened expectations around the so-called birthday present for the NHS, telling us to expect significant investment. Now, we know the NHS is experiencing the biggest financial squeeze in its history, that public health and training budgets have been cut and capital budgets have been raided, with the consequence we have £5 billion backlog for repairs. We know that the sister service of the NHS, publicly funded social care, has suffered swinging cuts of £6.3 billion. Your trusts are in deficit and financial strain means the NHS is failing to meet its constitutional standards. It's clear that our NHS and social care sector need a long-term plan. It's what I've been calling for since I became the Shadow Health Secretary in 2016. And we're told the plan is imminent. But I'm struck by the world of difference between what is happening today and the way a long-term plan was last put in place by the Labour government in 2002. 17 years ago, Gordon Brown tasked Derek Wanless with conducting a comprehensive analysis of the future health needs of the country and the options for funding it. Now, based on that in-depth analysis, Gordon Brown introduced a specific and sustainable tax increase for the NHS, not hypothecation, but a tax increase for a purpose, clearly understood and endorsed by the public. It helped deliver, as you know, record investment tied to modernisation to tackle waiting lists and rapidly expand NHS capacity. It culminated in some of the lowest waiting lists and highest satisfaction ratings. And it all began as a thorough, detailed process run by the Treasury, not hindered by it. I don't think the same can be said today. And the worry is that in the next couple of weeks, even perhaps as soon as next week, we'll get a half-baked panic settlement that fails to satisfy expectations. So I'd like to offer my own 5 tests on how to judge whether such a settlement is satisfactory. So first, on the funding test. Labour's commitment is a fully funded NHS and social care service to fulfil the obligations enshrined in the Constitution and to improve the quality of care for the future. Our plan at the 2017 general election would have involved spending nearly £9 billion extra this year on health and social care, paid for by fair increases in taxation on the wealthiest in society. That would amount to more than a 5% increase in the first year of a Labour government, paid for by asking the top 5% to pay more income tax, increasing taxation on private medical insurance, and increasing corporation tax. And because our commitment is to a fully funded NHS, we'd also establish an OBR-style process to advise us on the funding needs for the future. So our first test is to whether the government are prepared to take the fair decisions on taxation to fund our NHS and public social care for the long term, increasing spending by around an extra £9 billion this year too. And just as we need significantly more investment in the day-to-day running of our NHS, we need more investment in capital as well. We know we have a backlog of around £5 billion in repairs thanks to years of capital to revenue shifts. And in recent months, as I've visited many trusts, especially mental health trusts, I've seen the desperate need for capital investment in the estates of our NHS too. Now, earlier this week, I revealed the NHS is relying on decades-old medical equipment, often in use long past its recommended replacement date. And of course, we know the NHS is still using nearly 12,000 fax machines. We have around the lowest numbers of CT and MRI scanners in the OECD, and across the whole NHS, we need better digital support. And over the coming years, artificial intelligence, bespoke nutrition, robotics, digital health technologies, the Internet of Things will all offer huge opportunities for improving health outcomes in the future too. So Labour would invest at least an extra £10 billion in capital in the NHS. We would expand R&D investment across the board by £1.3 billion during the first 2 years of the next Labour government. And to support the spread and adoption of innovation, we would increase funding for the Academic Health Sciences Network too. Now on staffing, because the NHS is not simply about money, it's about values, about principles, and crucially, it's about people. Over these past 6 months, I've spent days out in the front line in the NHS, quietly shadowing staff. I've spent time with a registrar in a busy A&E, with an anaesthetist in trauma. I've been on the road with paramedics. I've helped deliver meals with hospital catering staff. I've followed a mental health nurse on an inpatient ward. I've sat in a large acute hospital's Gold Command bed meeting this winter, trying to manage flow through the system. And although in my time on the front line, I've only seen a snapshot, it's clear the pressures you are all under. Now this winter, like every winter, I joined with most politicians in publicly praising the NHS staff for going the extra mile to ensure patients get treated throughout one of the most difficult periods in years. It's a phrase that's used so often by the media, commentators and politicians that it's in danger of becoming a cliche. Of course you go the extra mile. In fact, you go the extra mile and then a mile after that and a mile after that. You always have and you always do. That's because of your deep recognition and commitment to the core values of the NHS and the mission you deliver to provide care and help to your fellow citizens every minute of every hour of every day, come what may. It's deep in the DNA of the NHS as a service and the people who work in it. But if I was a member of frontline staff, I'd be asking the very reasonable question of politicians and leaders. We've gone the extra mile for you. When are you going to go the extra mile for us? Well, Labour is determined to go the extra mile for you and your staff, because ultimately it's the staff and management of the NHS who deliver for patients and their family. And if there's one gentle criticism I have of some of my predecessors, it was a tendency to sometimes go for the cheap shot of blaming NHS bureaucracy or NHS management for the ills of the NHS. I have never adopted that approach and I never will. Great world-leading services like the NHS depend in part on great world-leading managers. But a question I have for government is whether they have a credible plan to ensure the NHS has the necessary staff for the future. We know we have a vacancy gap across the NHS of 100,000, including for more than 40,000 nurses and midwives, 11,000 doctors, 12,000 support staff, 11,000 scientific, technical and therapeutic staff. Every junior doctor I talk to raises concerns about rota gaps. We know numbers of community nurses, mental health nurses, learning disability nurses have all fallen since 2010. And of course we know in primary care GP numbers are falling too, putting pressure on the whole service. Well, as a start, Labour will bring back the training bursary for nurses and allied health professionals. And we are calling on the government to immediately drop the restrictive so-called hostile environment visa regime, currently denying so many hospitals access to the very best international clinical staff. But I also want to begin a discussion with you about the way in which care is delivered. By 2020, the population of over 65s will grow to 15.4 million. The number of over 85s will double. And as we all live longer, the disease burden changes too. And health and care services increasingly must respond to the complexity of the conditions we all live with. So the future ability of the NHS to deliver whole person care demands, I believe, on greater integration, coordination between community care, primary care, mental health services and social care, all working with the acute sector. We all know that mental health and community services are one of the biggest challenges facing the NHS. I had the very great pleasure earlier this year of visiting North Staff's combined healthcare NHS trust in Stoke-on-Trent. They and their partners in the wider NHS, primary care, local government, the voluntary sector, are working in one of the most challenging health economies in England. They are rising to that challenge by working together in partnership and succeeding in delivering results in delayed transfers of care and improving care homes and in developing an award-winning hub co-locating health, social care and community practitioners to provide support to the patients of GP practices. This year, for the first time in the Trust's history, the CQC rated every combined service as good or outstanding. And yet, rather than enabling collaboration and partnership, the current NHS landscape frustrates it. The 2012 Health and Social Care Act has delivered a fragmented wasteful mess, an organisational no man's land with structures not fit for purpose, as Alan Milburn said last week. Of course, Labour believes healthcare should be delivered not on the basis of markets, but on the basis of partnership and planning. I believe that compulsory competition between NHS organisations goes against the grain of the core values of the NHS. It creates huge expense and waste for NHS bodies as you are forced to work against each other rather than with each other. And the heart of the competition in NHS since the Thatcherite creation of the internal market and the purchaser-provider split exacerbates this. It has led to a vast and wasteful bureaucracy of competition, accountancy, consultancy, regulation and fragmentation. It's divided those with day-to-day experience of caring for patients from those holding the purse strings and deciding which services get funding and which do not. For every NHS body winning funds to provide any particular service, there'll be several more whose money and staff time has simply been poured down the drain in failed tender bids. So enabling collaboration and integration rather than competition and waste will be our fourth key test of the government's funding plans. Ending fragmentation, ending the so-called purchaser-provider split, and instead moving towards genuine integration, coordination, planning and partnership. These are key goals for Labour, and in the coming months I want to begin a discussion with you about what that means for the NHS landscape in the future. Finally, it's my ambition as a potential Health Secretary, not just to restore funding and capacity to our NHS, but also to tackle some of the shameful health inequalities in society. I want to give prevention a greater priority than it's ever had before. We would invest in public health and expand the public health workforce. We would prioritise child health and well-being outcomes, because after many years of progress, health outcomes for babies and young children in the UK are stalling. For example, we are lagging behind most other high-income countries on mortality, breastfeeding and obesity rates. So as we use this opportunity of the 70th year of the NHS to reflect on the next stage of the NHS's development, I believe a laser-like focus on improving the health and well-being of every child must be an absolute priority. As Labour Shadow Health Secretary, I've gone as far as to say our ambition should be to make Britain's children the healthiest in the world. It's a huge ambition, certainly, but I think it's right to be ambitious for our children, and we would start by banning the advertising of junk food on family TV to start dealing properly with the obesity crisis we now face as a nation. The NHS stands at a critical juncture. In this, the 70th anniversary of the NHS, the Health Secretary and Government have a chance to reset the trajectory of the last 8 years. A quick fix or a fudge won't do. We need a long-term plan for our NHS and social care sector. I believe my party, working with our frontline NHS staff like you, can deliver on just that. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you, John. Thank you for staying around. I blurted out, of course, that he wasn't here. As a result, of course, lots of people haven't heard him, which is a shame. But I hope you've had a good first day and that it's met your expectations. We began with the Institute of Fiscal Studies Health Foundation report, Challenge of Funding. We reflected on the integration agenda with Matthew and the panel. And from Ian, we got the promise of reform of NHS I&E, but also the challenge, frankly, to us all on productivity and efficiency. Simon's session, as ever, absolutely packed out and very engaging. Interesting about his comments on social care and at least the hope, the prospect that something will come in social care, even if it's not aligned in timing. Two other vital sessions today, one on mental health, surely one of the major challenges for the 10-year plan or strategy, and the one on equality and diversity. And surely the message there is that this is not just a moral imperative, but something that we now recognise is core to the effectiveness of our business and indeed to who we are as a service. So now it's time for some R&R, if I'm allowed to use more acronyms. If you'd like to join us on the Confed stand for a glass of something, you'd be more than welcome to do so now. Have a great evening. See you tomorrow.
Nas lembranças felizes você chora.